I don't know why they're here, but they seem like a nice bunch.
Oh, yeah. Let's hang out.
Okay, let's hang out. Let's talk about music. Hi, I'm Robert McBride of All Classical Portland, and this is Carlos Kalmar, music director of the Oregon Symphony.
Good evening.
And that's Neil DuPont, principal percussionist.
Yeah, he's
And,
here just to control that I don't say anything wrong, right? Hi, Neil.
And as you can see, there are more percussion toys here than you could shake a mallet at. And some hanging above your heads. You know the story of Haydn's Miracle Symphony, that the chandelier fell down during the performance and no one was injured because they had all moved up close to the stage to get a better look at Haydn. So it's known as the Miracle Symphony. So if those fall down tonight,
Then we are going to have a miracle.
the Miracle
Hopefully.
Concerto. You know, I thought I would never have an opportunity to hear and see From Me Flows What You Call Time by Toru Takemitsu in my whole life, unless I moved to Tokyo or New York or someplace, and even then I'd have to be lucky. And you're bringing it to us tonight and Monday. Thank you.
Well, it's one of those interesting coincidences. Kind of over a year ago, I just had lunch with Steve Bloom, the president of the Japanese Garden here in Portland. And we talked about doing something together. Because...
This is in your program,
Yeah.
encouraging you to become a member of the Japanese Garden if you're not already. Sorry, continue.
And on that occasion, he told me that we're commemorating something for the Japanese Garden here in Portland. And then he told me, which I thought, oh, I like to hear that, that the Japanese Garden in Portland, Oregon is considered by Japanese scholars who know something about not only gardening itself, but about the flair of what a Japanese garden should have, that Portland is probably the best garden in the United States. There are, as you know, several Japanese gardens all over the map, but Portland is considered kind of the best. And the reason, if I can say it in my Western language that is not English, is that actually it's small, it's minimalistic, it is incredibly atmospheric, and I always would say, if you want to have peace and quiet and time to look inside of you, go to the Japanese Garden. It's the best place.
Yeah, it really, really is lovely. It changes your perspective.
Yeah.
I was there one time, and the sound of a shakuhachi came wafting out. There was somebody playing that wonderful Japanese wooden flute hidden in the trees. I couldn't see him or her, but it was a lovely addition, right place at the right time.
It's another thing that we have here in Portland that is worth checking out, aside from the food carts. or other coffee shops.
And the Oregon Symphony.
And the Oregon Symphony.
Okay, so 2 pieces on tonight's concert. Wait, this is the first concert of the subscription series, which is why you and I are sitting here right now. So that means you'll start with the Star Spangled Banner, probably, right?
We have to explain that.
No, but I just wanted to do that. Okay.
Musically, okay, never mind.
Yeah. And then this amazing percussion concerto, From Me Flows What You Call Time, by Toru Takemitsu, a wonderful, largely self-taught Japanese composer, inspired a lot by French music. I first discovered him watching a public television program in the 1970s on this little tiny black and white TV. And it was something about Japan, and the music was so cool. It was a combination of East and West. And so I watched the whole thing and looked very carefully at the credits because I wanted to know who wrote that. And that was my first exposure to Toru Takemitsu. What was yours?
I actually don't recall, because Takemitsu pretty much is one of the only composers who has been performed in concert halls fairly regularly, I only know about him that, first of all, he was kind of discovered a little bit by chance, if that story is true. Allegedly it happened because Igor Stravinsky put a long play on the wrong side. I mean, he played the long play and he played it this way instead of that way. and he heard a piece of music by a 25-year-old Mr. Takemitsu and said like, huh? Wait a second, probably sat down and then said, this is absolutely marvelous music. And from there kind of departed the story, because to be so successful as a composer in nowadays and being self-taught, that's already tricky. Then you learn a little bit about Takemitsu, and you learn, and maybe that's where a little bit of the French influence comes from, that during his younger years, he actually did not embrace his own culture at all. He really went, I mean, which is no wonder. There is no tradition per se in terms of writing music in Japan, China, of writing for what we call normal orchestras, our kind of instruments. So they all have to migrate towards Western culture. So did Takemitsu, and ended up writing without any influence of Asian music, just in order to later in life thinking about where he came from, embracing that too, and out comes a piece like the one you're going to hear tonight, which on one side sounds French, because it sounds French at times, but I think that probably you don't even realize that it sounds somehow French in terms of how the harmonies work and how sometimes luscious this piece is, because from the first moment, literally first moment of the piece, you're completely transformed. And when the percussion soloists, all 5 of them, start to play, you are going to think you are in a different world. And it's not so much that you think you're in Asia. I don't think that's the case. You are going to experience, probably for the only time in all our life, what music can do that is not written by a Westerner. Because we all know, we have, probably many of you are subscribers, many of you have been to the Oregon Symphony. You know what it means when music does something to you. You know when music makes you happy, when it makes you sad, when it makes you think this and that, and all through music by composers like Mozart, Strauss, Brahms, Mahler, Sibelius, and others. And here comes Takemitsu, and if you think music per itself is a skyscraper, there are several rooms in this sky, or it's a huge house, several rooms. There is the room of the Germans. There is the room of the Americans, and so on. Just making this up. Tonight is your chance. You're going to a room that you, trust me, you've never been there before, and it's mind-boggling. And the great thing about this is, I'm sure this piece, wherever it's being played, is very successful because it's always fascinating. But I thought, well, at the end, there is something strange about this music too, something weird. And well, come on, we are here in Portland. Portland is weird, right? So, right piece for us.
And these multicolored ribbons represent the elements: fire, air, water, earth. And the piece is kind of like wandering through the Japanese garden and looking at these different trees and different colors, and then you come around a corner and then there's something different. It doesn't have the sense of direction that, say, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony does, that you start here and it builds and it builds and it builds to this point. It's not so direct that way.
This piece is actually the exact, I would say it has direction, but it works so differently because, again, in classical music as we know it, music, let's just take a movement of a symphony like Beethoven 5. Music always travels towards a climax and then declines. That's what music always does. So it's always like climbing a mountain and getting down on the other side, depending on how the mountain is shaped and whether there is a cliff. Doesn't really matter. This piece does not do that. This piece works a little bit in little passages, and the way you walk this mountain or this landscape or whatever you imagine you walk slowly. Because this piece is also very much linked to not only what I think is Japanese, but also to this kind of philosophy of the Japanese, also the philosophy of Buddhism. And so everything is quiet, everything looks at the inside of things. And there is when I read about this piece, I thought, well, that is actually a great sentence. When you think about energy in a piece, I'm sorry. I'm easily disturbed, as you know. The idea of energy. When in music we deal with the idea of energy, we always think about things that are loud and often about things that are fast. So, I mean, easiest example, just watch out for what happens in Scheherazade by Rimsky-Korsakov. And there is a great amount of those things in this Takemitsu piece, but most of it is silence. How can I explain this? I personally believe, have you ever thought about that, for example, Richard Wagner composes a piece and gets to some point in the piece, the music declines, gets very soft, and then very often the timpani does boom. Boom. And between these booms, there is silence. And silence is music. In this piece, it's not so much that silence is being utilized so much, but the fascination of things that are empty, but there is something in there. And that is things that don't have anything inside, but there is energy. And that is something that this piece does so brilliantly. This piece is also linked to Tibetan Buddhism. I mean, essentially the 5 colored ribbons are linked to that because, and specifically to the idea of the wind horse. To explain it maybe in 2 sentences, the nomad Tibetans sometimes, when they look out where should they go next, they get into a ceremony in which they use colored flags, ribbons, that they let float in the wind of these 5 colors, which are the 5 elements. And where this wind goes, this wind horse, that's where the Tibetan nomads will go next. And that's kind of a little bit of the background of the music. Another thing is the role of the orchestra in this piece, because the 5 soloists, the 5 percussionists are really absolutely central, and just by the fact of the strange instruments that you are going to hear them play, just that is like, how on earth do they do that? I mean, you cannot see but for example, Neil, not that so help me out, name of the thing on the timpani. That's a Buddhist here on the timpani you know, we utilize that all the time. There are 2 temple bowls, and back there on another set of timpani, there are several small ones. This is how they sound. This is the only trick we will show you because it's so fascinating. And now you see the move, but now listen what you can do and what the piece does with sound. Can you know?
This might be a good time to remind all of us that Voyager 1 recently left the solar system.
And this is only one of the instruments. I mean, you see this is full of instruments. And just the fascination of how music was. And lastly, the role of the orchestra in this piece is also fascinating. Soloists are front and center. The orchestra kind of is the skeleton that embraces them, never overwhelms them, and then retracts and leaves them into space. Technically speaking, this is a piece, I believe, that at the end leaves you with the sense that it could go on for another hour. And that's the intent too. It's this Zen-like idea.
Cool, huh? Yeah, I can't wait. I'm so looking forward to this. Then intermission. Just an intermission. Then, before there were movies, before there were motion pictures and motion picture scores, there was Scheherazade by Rimsky-Korsakov, which is the best example I can think of music for a movie that doesn't exist. You create it in your head as you listen to the piece, inspired by the 1001 Nights. And you'll hear Sarah Kwok play those lovely violin solos representing Scheherazade, telling the stories so that she can prolong her life the next day and the next day and the next day and the next, and then all this color and stuff going on in the orchestra. And it'll really fire your imagination.
Does everybody here, I mean, stupid thought, does everybody know what 1001 Nights is actually about? What actually happened? Everybody knows this? Okay.
A little bit. That's probably true of all of us.
I mean, actually, it's very simple. The Gross, the Sultan.
I actually didn't want to talk about that because I think the story is so horrible.
The story is horrible. Sure is the story horrible. Of course, the Sultan, many wives. The Sultan, for God knows what reason, thinks that women are all false and liars. And therefore, the Sultan, after the first night with each of his wives, has her killed, all of them. Until one day, the Princess Scheherazade is kind of the next woman in line, if you want, and she starts to tell him stories. When he wakes up and says, okay, you're out, your head is gone, she starts to telling him stories, and she tells him stories for 1001 nights, until he finally says, okay, I'm done with my practice. Can you please stop telling me stories? Or something like that. And
so yeah, there is a happy ending.
There is a happy ending. So it's a gruesome story with a happy ending. And Rimsky-Korsakov was fascinated by this topic and created this piece. One of the wonderful catches of this piece, if you want, is that actually the piece ends the way it begins. Because how on earth are you going, in 45 minutes of music, put 1001 nights, probably 1001 stories into that?
It'd all have to be haiku. And that would tie it into the first half of the concert.
Exactly. So essentially, Rimsky tells 4 stories. And because the solo violin, played by Sarah Kwok, is Scheherazade at the end. Scheherazade talks, and the piece ends with probably the next story, something like that. One great thing that happened is we are here confronted with Scheherazade with one of the best pieces of program music. And program music, per se, if you will, was initiated 50 years before this piece by a guy named Hector Berlioz and his Symphony Fantastique. And so here we are, And we are actually in a very important year of musical history because it's 1888. And this is the year in which two other compositions were actually presented to the public who made the career of their composers. One is the first symphony of Gustav Mahler, and the second was a tone poem, program music per se, Don Juan by Richard Strauss, same year. Now the fascinating thing about the program of how program music works and how this piece works is, yeah, this is program music. It is inspired by a tale, very clearly. And normally, program music, I can tell, if I would have an orchestra with program music, I can tell you, and this symbolizes this sentence in the story, or here the person gets arrested, or whatever it is, depending on the story. In this story, Scheherazade, none of this is revealed. All you know is the Sultan is there, Scheherazade is there, she starts to tell stories. You know the title of the stories, and the scholars are not even sure whether the title of the last story is, they don't agree. It's whether it's this or that, it doesn't matter. But what really is in the story, you don't know. And it's not revealed, and it's not about that. In essence, make up your own mind.
And make up your own story. As you listen, you can hardly help it. Do you remember what happened in Paris in 1910? One of the most famous ballet premieres, Stravinsky's Firebird.
I want to say that cannot. I wanted to say Rite of Spring, but that was 13.
Ballet Russe,
Ballet Russe.
Stravinsky in his mid-20s, virtually unknown composer, huge international star overnight with the premiere of the Firebird. Well, the Ballet Russe presented their version of Scheherazade that same season, and sometimes on the same bill with the Firebird. We never hear about that. It's a fun example of the student totally overshadowing the teacher, because Stravinsky studied with Rimsky.
Well, the thing about Rimsky, which is interesting, is we know Rimsky in two different, two things that he did very well. He wrote music and he instrumentated. Very, very, very well. Actually, at the time when he was composing Scheherazade, it was the time during which Rimsky was instrumentating Prince Igor by Alexander Borodin. And he did several other pieces. We have been playing, sadly this is a piece that I don't think we ever will hear in Portland because it's so insanely costly. The great opera Boris Godunov by Modest Mussorgsky, we played it probably for, I don't know, 60 years, 70 years in the instrumentation of Rimsky-Korsakov. Until finally, a couple of decades back, it was kind of redone, the version by Mussorgsky himself. Differences, by the way, and this is kind of a characteristic of Rimsky-Korsakov. Rimsky-Korsakov is really brilliant. Really, it shines, it glows, his music. It's so full of energy. And in pieces like Scheherazade, that works, it's so amazing how it works. Boris Godunov, if you hear the original and the Rimsky version, sometimes you think, oh, the Rimsky version is more gutsy, but in the end, the Mussorgsky version is darker, more Russian, but different story. But that's what he did. Because, you know, in music history, we all know that there are two very, very, very big instrumentators, if you will, teachers of how to use the instruments of the orchestra. One is Hector Berlioz, and the other is Richard Strauss, masters of instrumentation.
No, and Ravel's better than Strauss.
Are we? Yeah, but yeah, sure.
Fortunately, we're out of time.
We're going to settle this outside.
Yeah.
No, the thing is, the thing. Actually, my point was that we all forget that Rimsky-Korsakov was a master of instrumentation. And he was also, in a way, a teacher of instrumentation. Without him, other composers would not be possible. I give you one thing, of course Ravel is incredible as an instrumentation, but Ravel, the difference between Ravel and Strauss, just to make my point, of course, is Ravel wrote only a certain number of orchestral pieces, and all of them are really great music, really great music. And on top of that, they are instrumentated in a way that's mind-boggling. Strauss wrote a few more, and some of his pieces are not the best music there is, but the way the music sounds is phenomenal. And Strauss knew that. Strauss always said, yeah, I know the invention of my melodies sometimes is like, okay, but what I do with the melodies, nobody can do. And he was right.
And a great example of that is Salome in Portland Opera's doing it in a new
Well,
production.
that actually is, by the way, not to lobby for our friends at the opera, but that is actually the best piece by Strauss. Yeah. Right?
That's another horrible story, but nobody could have said it to music better.
Exactly.
And not even Ravel. No, Ravel would not have done that. We really do have to stop. The orchestra has to tune and get ready, and you want to read your program notes and meet whoever's sitting next to you. Thank you for coming. You're going to love this concert. It's going to blow your mind. Carlos Kalmar.
Robert McBride.
Ravel.